Today's story is Prince Hyacinth and the Dear Little Princess. You'll find this story on pages 382 to 388. Exposition is when we find out about the setting of the story and the characters, and this happens on the first page of the story. We find out that there is a king and he is really in love with this princess, and he really wants to marry her, so he finds a fairy and he asks the fairy how he should win the love of the queen or the princess. So the fairy tells him that the princess is under an enchantment, and if he steps on her cat's tail, then the enchantment will be broken and he can marry the princess. So he's determined to step on the cat's tail, and he tries and tries. Finally, the cat falls asleep and he steps on the cat's tail. The cat turns into the enchanter, and the enchanter gives him a message. The enchanter tells the king that he may marry the princess, but he will have his revenge for him stepping on the tail. So he said that they will have a baby, and the baby will have a huge nose until he recognizes that he has a huge nose. The king thinks this is ridiculous because how on earth could someone have a big nose and not realize it? If he's blind or if he doesn't have any hands to feel his nose, then maybe, but otherwise he's obviously going to see his nose, right? So this is the enchanter goes away, and the king ends up marrying the princess, and they do have a baby, and the baby does have a big nose, but the king dies. So now it's just the queen and the baby. And the queen is concerned about the baby and his nose, but everyone around the queen tells the queen that actually his nose isn't that bad, and he's really, really handsome with his nose, and it's a Roman nose, which is a nose with like a kind of a big bump in the middle, right? And they explain to her how actually the nose is very attractive. So the queen and all the people surrounding the prince spend the prince's whole childhood. They put pictures all over the walls of people with big noses. They tell the prince stories of people who have big noses and are heroes, and people with small noses who are villains. And they all laugh at people with small noses, and so they convince the prince through flattery that having a big nose is actually the best thing, and he is extremely handsome because of his nose. So the prince believes them. So what is the prince's personal flaw? It's his big nose, right? But his character flaw is pride, and he has become like this because everybody flatters him and tells him how amazing he is, right? Once the prince is an adult, his mom wants him to get married. So she shows him pictures of all these princesses. And he sees this one particular princess, the Dear Little Princess, and he thinks she's just beautiful. The only problem with her is she has a really small nose. But she's so pretty, he overlooks this. And he thinks she's just amazing. So he goes to talk to her father and try to negotiate a marriage. But she is suddenly taken away. And she's taken away by the same enchanter that gave him the big nose. So when this happens, he's super, super sad, and he just starts to wander around the world. And when he's wandering around, he gets really hungry, and he sees this old woman who happens to be the fairy. And he goes to her house, and when she first sees him, she laughs at him because of his big nose, and he laughs at her because she has such a small nose. And she takes him to her house, and she's going to feed him dinner. And so we suddenly see her character flaw, and her character flaw is she talks way too much, right? But the funny thing is, she actually doesn't realize she talks too much. And it says at the end of the first column of 385, and while you are eating, I can tell you my story in a few words, for I don't like endless tales myself. Too long a tongue is worse than too long a nose, and I remember when I was young that I was much admired for not being a great chatterer. So we can see that she also was flattered as she was young for not talking a lot, even though she actually does talk a lot. She talks so much that Prince gets hungry and he gets frustrated because she's talking so much that he can't eat at first, right? So this is where we have dramatic irony. This is when the reader is aware of something, but the characters are not aware, right? And so Prince Hyacinth can see that the fairy talks too much, and she can see that he has a big nose, but they can't admit their own faults. But we as the readers do see this. And another ironic thing is they both think that they are immune to flattery, but the flattery has blinded them. At the bottom of 385, the prince, he says, "How stupid people are not to see their own faults. That comes of being a princess. She has been spoiled by flatterers who have made her believe she is quite a moderate talker." So he can clearly see the fairy's faults, but he doesn't see his own. Throughout the dinner, the fairy talks again and again and again about his nose, and he's really frustrated by it, and he won't believe her. And so no matter how much she tries to convince him, he's convinced his nose is perfectly fine and there's nothing wrong with his nose. But he is convinced that she talks way too much. And he says at the top of 386, or he's thinking, "Well," he thought as he ate his supper, "I am very glad I came here. This just shows me how sensible I have been in never listening to flatterers. People of that sort praise us to our faces without shame, and hide our faults and change them into virtues. For my part, I will never be taken in by them. I hope I know my own defaults." And so he thinks he knows where his flaws are, but he is completely unaware. Even though the fairy is trying to convince him he has a big nose, he's unaware of it. So after dinner, he's not hungry anymore, and he leaves the fairy's house, and he keeps wandering in hopes of finding the princess. And everywhere he goes, people comment on his big nose, and he won't believe them. So the fairy, she has an idea. She wants to show him how she wants to get him to recognize his faults, and she comes up with a plan. So she takes the dear little princess, and she locks her up in a crystal prison. And the prince goes to this crystal prison to try to free her. And the fairy puts an enchantment on it, and he can't get her out unless he admits his fault. So the princess puts her arm through the bars and for the prince to kiss her hand. And he tries to go to kiss her hand, and he can't because his nose is too big. So he turns his face, can't kiss her hand. And then finally he sees his fault. And he says at the bottom of the first column of 387, "Well, it must be admitted that my nose is too long." And then it says, "In an instant, the crystal prison flew into 1,000 splinters." So this is symbolic. It frees the princess from the prison, but also at this moment, since he's admitted his fault, he is freed from his imprisonment of kind of blindness, right? He doesn't see his faults, and now he sees them. So this has a actual meaning and a literal meaning and a figurative meaning. So there are two main themes here. There's an explicit theme that the fairy mentions at the very end. Second to last paragraph, she says, "You see how self-love keeps us from knowing our own defects of mind and body. Our reason tries in vain to show them to us. We refuse to see them till we find them in the way of our interest." So she's saying that we're going to be blind to our own faults until they get in the way of something we want to do. There's another implicit theme earlier on, also mentioned by the fairy, and she says one may be very worthy though his nose is too long, just saying that our character is not defined by what's on the outside, but what's on the inside. So the fact that he has a big nose isn't actually a big deal. It's way more about his character. So the author of this story, his tone towards both Prince Hyacinth and the fairy is kind of disapproving but also amused. So he disapproves of their faults and their failures, but he also is thinks it's a little bit funny because these types of not admitting our own faults is common to all humans, right? We want to think the best of ourselves. And then the author uses dramatic irony for humor, right? Since both of these characters won't admit their own faults, it is kind of funny because the faults themselves are kind of funny. The characters themselves are not bad people. They're pretty likable characters, even with their faults. And having a big nose is kind of a funny thing, right? Not a serious character flaw. And the fairy talking too much is also a funny flaw. It's not really a big deal. So this just adds humor to this story. And at the last question, The author asks us to compare Matthew 7, 1 through 5 and Psalm 139, 23 through 24. So Matthew 7, 1 through 5 talks about finding our own faults first, right? It talks about taking the log out of your own eye before you take a speck out of someone else's eye. This is not saying that we can never point out someone else's faults, but it's encouraging us to look at our own faults first and deal with those before we point out someone else's faults. And Psalm 139, 23 and 24. So the Psalm verse says, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the everlasting way." So both of these verses together teach us that God wants us to recognize our weakness and to rely on Him to work on those weaknesses. All right, I hope you guys enjoyed this story. Let me know if you have any questions.